The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows of the old theater, casting long shadows across the empty seats. Richard Hart ran a tired hand through his graying hair and glanced at his watch. 6 hours of auditions had drained what little enthusiasm he had left. At 52, with 3 decades of directing under his belt, he was beginning to wonder if he'd lost his touch. "How many more?" he asked, not bothering to look up from his notes. Lisa, his assistant, checked her clipboard. "Just one more for today, a boy. He's been waiting since noon." Richard groaned. "A kid for this production?" He shook his head. "This isn't some school play. Tell him we're looking for professionals." Lisa hesitated. "He's been here all day, Rich. His uncle drove him 3 hours to get here. Maybe just give him 2 minutes." Something in her voice made Richard look up. Lisa wasn't one to plead for auditioners. 20 years as his right hand had made her just as tough as he was. Richard sighed and waved his hand in surrender. "Fine, 2 minutes. Then we're done." The heavy door at the back of the theater creaked open. Richard squinted, trying to make out the small figure walking down the center aisle. The boy couldn't have been older than 12, skinny as a rail with clothes that hung a size too large on his frame. His sneakers were worn at the edges and his dark hair needed a trim. But there was something about the way he walked. Not cocky, not nervous, just purposeful. Richard leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He'd seen this movie before. Well-meaning relatives pushing their talented kids into auditions they weren't ready for. It never ended well, and he hated being the bad guy who had to crush their dreams. But the theater was a tough business, and sugarcoating rejection didn't do anyone any favors. "Name?" Richard called out, his voice echoing in the empty theater. "Ben Thompson," the boy answered, his voice surprisingly steady. "And what will you be performing for us today, Ben?" Lisa asked kindly. "I'd like to sing Finding My Way Home from your last show," Ben replied. Richard raised an eyebrow. That was an ambitious choice, a complex piece with difficult timing and emotional depth. Professional singers struggled with it. The kid was either clueless or overconfident. "You know this is a professional production, right?" Richard asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "We're casting for Broadway, not the school talent show." A flash of something, not quite hurt, more like determination, crossed Ben's face before he nodded. "Yes, sir. I know." Richard glanced at his watch again. He had dinner plans across town in an hour, and traffic would be a nightmare. Part of him wanted to send the kid home without an audition, save them both the awkwardness. But Lisa was watching him with that look she got when she thought he was being too harsh. "All right, Ben. The stage is yours. Try not to rush it." The boy climbed the small steps to the stage, looking even smaller under the bright lights. Richard braced himself for what was sure to be a painful 2 minutes. He'd watched countless children with star potential freeze up or struggle through auditions their parents had pushed them into. This would be no different. Ben stood center stage, closed his eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. Richard pulled out his phone, checking his messages while waiting for the boy to start. Probably building up courage, he thought, or having second thoughts. Either way, he'd make sure to let the kid down easy. When Ben didn't start singing after 30 seconds, Richard looked up impatiently. "Whenever you're ready," he called out. "Or if you've changed your mind, I'm ready," Ben interrupted, his voice different now, focused. "I don't have the music with me. Is that okay?" Richard blinked in surprise. "You want to sing without accompaniment?" "I practice without music at home," Ben explained. "But I can wait if you need to find the backing track." Lisa was already pulling it up on her tablet. "I have it right here. Starting from the beginning or the chorus?" "The whole song, please," Ben said with quiet confidence that made Richard sit up straighter. The gentle piano intro filled the theater. Richard watched as Ben closed his eyes again, swaying slightly with the melody. Great, he thought, the kid's got stage moves already. This should be interesting. When Ben opened his mouth to sing the first verse, Richard nearly dropped his coffee mug. The sound that filled the theater didn't match the small boy standing on stage. It was rich, pure, and carried an emotional weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. His pitch was nearly perfect, his timing impeccable. But it wasn't just the technical skill that stunned Richard. It was the raw feeling behind every word. Richard found himself leaning forward in his seat, coffee forgotten. This wasn't the voice of a child mimicking emotion he didn't understand. This was something else entirely. By the time Ben reached the chorus, Richard's arms had broken out in goosebumps. Finding my way home. Through the darkness I roam. The boy's voice soared on the high notes, then dropped to a heartbreaking whisper for the verse about lost dreams. There was a slight crack in his voice, not from lack of skill but from the emotion he was pouring into the song. It made the performance more real, more human. Richard glanced at Lisa. She sat motionless, clipboard forgotten in her lap, eyes wide with wonder. Even the sound technician, who usually paid no attention to auditions after the first few hours, had stopped what he was doing to listen. When Ben hit the final, challenging note and held it with perfect control before letting it fade into silence, the theater remained completely still. For several seconds, no one spoke or moved. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain his professional composure. Where did you learn to sing like that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ben shuffled his feet, suddenly looking like a normal 12-year-old again. "Nowhere, really. I just sing all the time. My mom says I've been singing since before I could talk properly." "No lessons? No choir?" Lisa asked incredulously. Ben shook his head. "We can't really afford lessons. I watch videos online sometimes, and I sing in the bathroom because it sounds better in there." A small, shy smile. "My uncle gets mad when I sing too late at night." Richard stood up slowly, still trying to process what he'd just witnessed. In 30 years of directing, he'd seen raw talent before, but this was different. This was the kind of voice that came along once in a generation, and it belonged to a skinny kid in worn-out sneakers who practiced in his bathroom. "Ben, how old are you?" Richard asked, walking toward the stage. "I'll be 13 next month," Ben replied. "And you've never performed professionally? Never been in a show?" Ben looked down. "Just school stuff. And I sing at my uncle's restaurant sometimes on weekends. The customers leave better tips when I do." Richard reached the edge of the stage and looked up at the boy. Up close, he could see the nervous energy in Ben's hands, the way he bit his lower lip waiting for judgment. This wasn't an overconfident kid with delusions of stardom. This was something much rarer, genuine talent without pretense. "Why this song?" Richard asked quietly. "It's not an easy choice." Ben's eyes met his, suddenly intense. "It was playing on the radio the day we drove away from our old house after Mom lost her job. I didn't know what it was called then, but the chorus stuck with me. When I found out later it was from one of your shows, it felt like, I don't know, like it was meant to be or something." He shrugged, embarrassed. "That sounds stupid, doesn't it?" "No," Richard said slowly. "It doesn't sound stupid at all." For the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him, the cynical shell he'd built up through decades in a brutal industry cracking ever so slightly. He remembered why he'd fallen in love with theater in the first place: its power to move people, to create moments of pure magic in an ordinary world. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that. Ben hesitated. "Did I do okay?" Richard looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw not just talent but heart. The kind of heart that could breathe life into characters and stories. The kind that could remind a jaded old director why his work mattered. "Ben," Richard said, a smile slowly spreading across his face, "I think we're going to need to talk to your uncle about your schedule for the next few months." The boy's eyes widened. "Does that mean—" "It means," Richard said, "that I'd like you to come back tomorrow. And bring your uncle. We have a lot to discuss." As Ben's face lit up with disbelief and joy, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. The thrill of discovering something extraordinary. Something that might just change everything. Not just for the boy, but for himself as well. Sometimes it seemed the most remarkable talents came in the most unassuming packages. And sometimes when you least expected it, they could help you find your own way home. The next morning, Richard arrived at the theater an hour early. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that voice. A boy's voice with a man's soul behind it. He'd spent half the night wondering if his memory had played tricks on him, if Ben's performance had really been as extraordinary as he remembered. The theater was quiet and cool in the morning light. Richard walked down to the front row and sat, staring at the empty stage. In a few hours, it would be filled with professional actors and singers for callbacks, people who'd spent years training, who'd paid thousands for lessons, who knew every trick in the book. And then there was Ben, a kid with worn shoes and no training who sang in his bathroom for practice. The side door opened, and Lisa walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're early," she said, handing him one of the cups. Richard nodded his thanks. Couldn't sleep, because of the boy? Lisa asked, sitting beside him. Am I crazy? Richard asked, turning to her. Did we both hear what I think we heard yesterday? Lisa smiled. We did. I pulled up the recording this morning just to be sure. It wasn't a fluke, Rich. That kid is something special. But he's so young, Richard said, rubbing his temples. And this show? The schedule would be brutal even for a seasoned performer. 8 shows a week, press events, recordings. It's too much for a child? Maybe, Lisa agreed. But he's not just any child, is he? Before Richard could answer, there was a knock at the theater door. He checked his watch, still 30 minutes before Ben and his uncle were supposed to arrive. Come in, he called out. The door swung open, and Ben walked in, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man with the same dark hair but none of the boy's delicate features. The man looked tired, with deep lines around his eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. Sorry we're early, the man said as they approached. Had to drop someone off nearby, so we figured we'd come straight over. Richard stood, extending his hand. Richard Hart, you must be Ben's uncle. Frank Thompson, the man said, his handshake firm but brief. Ben says you want him to come back for another audition? Richard glanced at Ben, who was standing slightly behind his uncle, eyes darting between the adults. Actually, Richard said, I was hoping to talk to you about Ben possibly taking part in our production. He gestured to the seats. Why don't we all sit down? Once they were seated, Richard studied Frank Thompson more carefully. The man looked guarded, protective, not the typical stage parent pushing their child into the spotlight. Ben has a remarkable voice, Richard began. One of the most naturally gifted I've heard in 30 years of directing. Frank nodded slowly. He gets it from his mother. My sister could sing like nobody's business. Richard caught the past tense. Could? A shadow passed over Frank's face. She passed away 2 years ago, cancer. He cleared his throat. Ben's been living with me since. Richard glanced at Ben, who was looking down at his hands. Suddenly, the emotion in the boy's voice made even more sense. I'm sorry to hear that, Richard said softly. Frank shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both immense pain and resignation. Life happens. We're getting by. What exactly are you offering here? Frank continued, his tone turning practical. Ben said something about a real show, but he gets excited. I want to understand what we're talking about. Richard leaned forward. Our production is a new musical that will open on Broadway in 4 months. It's a major production with significant backing. I believe Ben has the talent to play one of our lead roles, a young boy who discovers he has a special gift. Frank's eyebrows shot up. Broadway? You're talking about New York? Yes, Richard confirmed. The role would require relocating to New York for at least 6 months, possibly longer if the show does well. Frank shook his head immediately. We can't move to New York. I've got a job, a mortgage. Ben's got school. There would be compensation, of course, Richard said. The role pays well, and we provide tutoring for young performers. All expenses in New York would be covered. How much? Frank asked bluntly. Richard named a figure. Frank's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly composed his face. That's a lot of money, Frank admitted. But money isn't everything. This is Ben's life we're talking about. Richard respected the man's caution. Too often he'd seen parents leap at the chance for fame or fortune without considering what it would mean for their child. What about you, Ben? Richard asked, turning to the boy who had been quietly listening. What do you think? Ben looked surprised to be addressed directly. He glanced at his uncle, then back at Richard. Would I really get to sing on a real stage? Like with an audience and everything? He asked, his voice small but eager. Richard nodded. 8 shows a week. Full orchestra. Thousands of people. Ben's eyes grew wider. But I've never done anything like that before. What if I mess up? It was an honest question, not the cocky response Richard might have expected from other young talents he'd worked with. Everyone messes up sometimes, Richard told him. That's what rehearsals are for. And you'd have coaches to help you develop your voice and acting skills. Acting. Ben looked suddenly nervous. I don't know how to act. But you know how to feel, Richard said gently. When you sang yesterday, you weren't just hitting notes. You were telling a story. That's what acting is, at its heart. Frank cleared his throat. This all sounds nice, but there's a lot to consider. Ben's just a kid. This would change his whole life. You're right, Richard agreed. It would. And I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't believe he has something truly exceptional. But ultimately, this has to be a family decision. Lisa, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. What if we did a test run? Ben could come for a week of workshop sessions. See how he handles the material, the schedule, the environment. No commitment yet, Richard nodded. That's a good idea. It would give all of us a chance to see if this is the right fit. Frank considered this. And you'd cover the costs for that week? All of it, Richard confirmed. Travel, accommodation, meals. And we could schedule it during his spring break so he wouldn't miss school. Frank looked at Ben. What do you think, buddy? Want to try it out for a week? Ben bit his lip, thinking hard. Would you come too? He asked his uncle. Frank's face softened. Of course I would. Wouldn't let you go alone. Ben took a deep breath. Then I want to try. Richard felt a surge of excitement but kept his expression professional. Great, let's set it up. He turned to Frank. There's one more thing I'd like to do today if you're both comfortable with it. What's that? Frank asked. I'd like Ben to sing one more song. Something challenging. Something he's never sung before. Richard looked directly at Ben. I want to see how you handle something completely new. A flicker of worry crossed Ben's face, but then his jaw set with determination. Okay, I can try. Richard had been thinking about this challenge all night. He needed to be sure that Ben's performance wasn't just a fluke or a well-rehearsed party trick. He needed to see the boy's raw talent when pushed beyond his comfort zone. Lisa, can you pull up The Mountain's Heart from the new show? Richard asked. Lisa's eyes widened. Rich, that's the hardest piece in the entire production. Professional singers struggle with the key changes. I know, Richard said quietly. That's why I want to hear Ben try it. Frank looked concerned. If it's too difficult, it's okay, Uncle Frank, Ben interrupted. I want to try it. Richard handed Ben the lyric sheet. Take a few minutes to look this over. The song is about someone facing an impossible challenge and finding strength they didn't know they had. Ben nodded, studying the words intently. Richard watched him, wondering if he was pushing too hard. The song he'd chosen had been a point of contention among the production team. Some thought it was too complex, too emotionally demanding, even for adult performers. And here he was asking a 12-year-old boy with no training to attempt it. After a few minutes, Ben looked up. I think I understand it. You don't have to memorize it, Richard said. You can keep the paper. Just try to feel the emotions behind the words. Ben nodded and walked up to the stage, lyrics in hand. Lisa started the backing track, a haunting melody with subtle orchestration that built throughout the piece. As the introduction played, Richard saw Ben close his eyes again, the same way he had yesterday. The boy took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and when he opened his mouth to sing the first line, the world seemed to stop. The song was in a difficult key that required incredible range, shifting from deep resonant notes to soaring highs within the same phrase. Professional singers approached it with caution, often modifying certain passages to suit their limitations. But Ben attacked each note with fearless precision, as if he'd been singing the piece for years. When he reached the first key change, Richard held his breath. This was where most singers faltered. Ben hesitated for just a split second, his brow furrowing in concentration, then pushed through, his voice finding the new key with only the slightest wobble before settling in perfectly. By the final chorus, tears were streaming down Frank's face. Lisa sat motionless, her clipboard forgotten, and Richard knew, without a doubt, that what he was witnessing wasn't just talent. It was something rarer, something almost impossible to find. A natural gift combined with the kind of emotional intelligence that couldn't be taught. When the final note faded, Ben lowered the lyrics sheet and looked out uncertainly. Was that okay? Richard couldn't speak for a moment. Finally, he cleared his throat. Ben, that was... He struggled to find the right words. That was extraordinary. Ben's face broke into a relieved smile. Really? I messed up the middle part a little. You did better than singers with 20 years of training, Richard told him honestly. Frank stood up, wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. That was your mother's voice, he said roughly. Just like her. Ben's smile turned wistful. I wish she could have heard me sing on a real stage. She will, Frank said, putting an arm around his nephew's shoulders. In her own way, she will. Richard watched them, Father and son in all the ways that mattered, sharing a moment of grief and hope and possibility. He'd been in this business long enough to become cynical, to see talent as just another commodity. But there was something about Ben that cut through all of that. Something pure and genuine that reminded Richard why he'd fallen in love with theater in the first place. "So," Richard said, breaking the silence, "shall we talk about that workshop week?" 3 weeks later, Richard stood in the back of a large rehearsal space in New York, watching as Ben worked with Diane, the show's vocal coach. The workshop week had turned into 2, and now they were officially in pre-production. Frank had taken a leave of absence from his job, and Ben was settling into a temporary apartment the production company had arranged for them near Times Square. "Try it again. But this time, hold back a little at the beginning," Diane instructed. "Save some of that power for the big moment in the chorus." Ben nodded seriously, absorbing every piece of advice like a sponge. That was one of the things that had surprised Richard most during these early weeks, Ben's willingness to learn. Unlike many naturally gifted performers who resisted direction, believing their raw talent was enough, Ben listened carefully to everyone, from the choreographer to the lighting technicians. "He's a quick study, Peter," the show's composer whispered as he joined Richard at the back of the room. Richard nodded. "It's not just his voice, it's his attitude. No ego, rare in this business," Peter agreed. "How's his uncle handling all this?" "Better than I expected," Richard said. "He's protective but not controlling. Wants to make sure Ben still has time to just be a kid." As they spoke, Ben started the song again, this time holding back as Diane had suggested. The effect was striking, like watching a runner pace himself for a marathon rather than sprinting from the start line. By the time he reached the emotional peak of the song, the restraint made the release even more powerful. Diane clapped when he finished. "Perfect. That's exactly what we need." Ben smiled, a flash of childlike joy breaking through his focused demeanor. These moments reminded Richard that despite his extraordinary talent, Ben was still just a boy, one who deserved a childhood alongside this unexpected journey into Broadway. The rehearsal continued for another hour. Richard watched Ben master difficult choreography with the same determination he brought to his singing. There were moments of frustration, steps he couldn't quite get right, harmonies that challenged even his natural ear. But he never gave up, never complained. When they finally broke for lunch, Ben flopped down in a chair next to his uncle, who had been quietly observing from the corner. "You're doing great, buddy," Frank said, handing Ben a sandwich and a bottle of water. "The dancing is hard," Ben admitted, taking a hungry bite. Richard walked over to them. "Dancing is always the hardest part for singers, but you're picking it up faster than most." "Really?" Ben looked up, seeking honest reassurance rather than empty praise. "Really," Richard confirmed. "How are you feeling about everything?" "It's been a big change." Ben considered the question seriously. "It's scary sometimes. All these people depending on me, but I like it too. I like feeling like I'm good at something important." Frank ruffled Ben's hair. "Your mom would be proud." A shadow crossed Ben's face, the grief that Richard had come to recognize still fresh despite the 2 years since his mother's passing. It was that grief, Richard believed, that gave Ben's voice such emotional depth. He sang like someone who understood loss, because he did. "Speaking of people depending on you," Richard said, changing the subject, "the investors are coming to watch rehearsal tomorrow." Ben's eyes widened. "The people with the money?" Richard nodded. "They've heard about you, but they haven't seen you perform yet. They're curious." Frank straightened in his chair. "Curious how?" Richard hesitated. He'd been dreading this conversation. Some of them have concerns about building a show around such a young performer. They're worried about consistency, stamina, the usual things that come with casting a child in a leading role. "He's not just any child," Frank said defensively. "I know that," Richard said quickly. "And tomorrow is our chance to show them." Ben put down his sandwich, suddenly looking less hungry. "What if they don't like me?" The question hung in the air, voicing the fear that all of them, Ben, Frank, Richard, the entire creative team, had been carrying these past weeks. The show's financing wasn't fully secured yet. The investors could still pull out if they weren't convinced. Richard crouched down to look Ben in the eye. "They will like you. Just sing the way you always do. The way that made me believe in you from the first note." Ben nodded. but Richard could see the worry settling on his young shoulders. That evening, after rehearsal, Richard invited Frank for a coffee, while Ben rested at the apartment with a tutor, catching up on schoolwork. "How much trouble are we in with these investors?" Frank asked bluntly as soon as they sat down. Richard sighed. "No point sugarcoating it. The lead investor is a man named Victor Gray, old school Broadway, very traditional in his views about what makes a successful show. And kids aren't part of that vision? Not typically, no. He thinks they're unreliable, unprofessional." Frank's jaw tightened. "Ben is more professional than most adults I know." "I agree," Richard said. "But Victor needs to see that for himself. What happens if he doesn't like what he sees?" Richard stirred his coffee slowly. "If Victor pulls out, the other investors will likely follow. We'd have to find new backers, which could delay the production by months, maybe longer. And Ben's role would be in jeopardy," Richard admitted. "Victor is pushing for us to hire a young-looking 18-year-old as a backup plan." Frank's face darkened. "You didn't tell us that." "Because I don't intend to let it happen," Richard said firmly. "I've bet my reputation on Ben. I believe in him completely, but tomorrow needs to go well." Frank nodded slowly, processing the stakes. "I should tell him. He handles things better when he knows the truth." Richard admired the man's approach to parenting. "You're raising a good kid, Frank." A sad smile crossed Frank's face. His mother did most of the heavy lifting. "I'm just trying not to mess it up." Later that night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced his small apartment, going over the next day's schedule in his mind. Victor Gray wasn't just any investor. He was a kingmaker in Broadway circles, someone whose opinion carried enormous weight. Richard had worked with him on 3 previous shows, enough to know the man's stubbornness and his rigid ideas about what made a production successful. His phone rang just after midnight. It was Lisa. "What's wrong?" Richard asked immediately. "It's Ben," Lisa said, her voice tight with worry. "Frank just called. Ben's running a fever, pretty high one. He's worried he won't be able to perform tomorrow." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the floor tilt beneath him. "Have they called a doctor?" "Yes, they're waiting for him now. Frank says Ben's been pushing himself too hard, not getting enough rest. He's been trying to prove himself to everyone," Richard said quietly, guilt washing over him. Had they all asked too much of a 12-year-old boy? "What do you want me to do about tomorrow?" Lisa asked. Richard thought quickly. "Don't tell the investors anything yet. Let's see how Ben is in the morning. Maybe it's just a 24-hour thing." But as Richard hung up the phone, he knew they were in trouble. Even if Ben recovered enough to perform, he wouldn't be at his best. And anything less than his best might not be enough to convince Victor Gray. Richard barely slept. At 6 the next morning, he was at Ben and Frank's apartment. Frank answered the door looking exhausted. "How is he?" Richard asked without preamble. "Fever's down a little," Frank said, leading Richard inside. "But he's still weak. Doctor says it's just a virus, nothing serious, but he needs rest." Ben was on the couch, wrapped in blankets despite the warm apartment. His face was pale, his eyes glassy with fever. When he saw Richard, he tried to sit up. "I can still sing," he said, his voice raspy. "I just need some tea with honey." Richard sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing Ben. "The most important thing is for you to get better." Ben shook his head stubbornly. "I heard you and Uncle Frank talking yesterday about the money guy who doesn't think kids can do the job. I need to show him he's wrong." Richard looked at Frank, who shrugged helplessly. "I told you he handles things better when he knows the truth." "Ben," Richard said gently, "you're sick. No one expects you to perform when you're sick." "But what happens if I don't?" Ben asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Will they give my part to someone else?" Richard couldn't lie to him. "They might try." Ben's jaw set with that now familiar determination. "Then I have to sing today. I have to." "Buddy," Frank interjected, "your health comes first, always. We can find another show if this one doesn't work out." "But we moved here for this," Ben said, his voice cracking. "You took time off work. We can't go back with nothing." Richard felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. He had brought them here, convinced them to take this chance. And now, seeing Ben's desperation to not let everyone down despite his illness, Richard questioned whether he'd done the right thing. "The investors are coming at 2, Richard said finally. "That's 8 hours from now. I want you to rest until then." No talking, no rehearsing, nothing. If you're not better by 1 o'clock, we cancel. No arguments. Ben nodded, relief washing over his face. I'll be better, he promised. You'll see. As Richard left the apartment, Frank followed him into the hallway. He's pushing himself too hard, Frank said quietly. All he talks about is not disappointing you, not letting down the cast, not wasting this opportunity. I never meant to put that kind of pressure on him, Richard said. You didn't, Frank assured him. Ben puts it on himself. Always has. But he's still just a kid. He needs someone to protect him sometimes, even from himself. Richard nodded, understanding the gentle warning in Frank's words. If he's not well enough, I'll handle Victor and the other investors. And if they pull their money? Richard squared his shoulders. Then we'll find other investors, ones who believe in Ben as much as we do. As Richard walked away, he wondered if he was being naive. Broadway wasn't built on belief. It was built on money, reliability, and proven formulas for success. A sick child was the opposite of what hardened investors wanted to see. But there was something about Ben that defied conventional wisdom. Something that made Richard willing to risk everything on the chance that others would see what he saw. Not just an extraordinary voice, but an extraordinary human being. Now they just had to hope that a few hours of rest would be enough to let that extraordinary voice shine through the fever and fatigue. Because today wasn't just any audition. It was the moment that would decide whether Ben's Broadway dream lived or died. At 1:30 that afternoon, Richard paced the hallway outside the rehearsal room, checking his watch every few minutes. The investors had arrived early. Victor Gray and his entourage of financial advisors and theater experts, all looking polished and impatient in their expensive suits. Richard had asked them to wait in the conference room while the cast prepared, buying precious extra minutes for Ben. Lisa approached, her face tight with worry. Any word from Frank? Richard shook his head. Nothing yet. Victor's getting antsy in there. Keeps mentioning other projects he could be funding instead. Let him wait, Richard said, more sharply than he intended. Sorry, it's just, I know, Lisa said. You've got a lot riding on this. It wasn't just the show Richard was worried about, though. It was Ben, the boy who sang with his whole heart. The boy who, despite his extraordinary gift, was still just a child fighting a fever and the weight of expectations. The elevator doors opened, and Frank stepped out, supporting Ben with one arm around his shoulders. The boy looked pale but determined, dressed in his rehearsal clothes with a thick scarf around his neck. Ben, Richard said, hurrying over to them. How are you feeling? Better, Ben said, though his voice was still slightly hoarse. Frank gave Richard a look that said otherwise. His fever's down to just above normal. He insisted on coming. I told you I would sing, Ben said with a stubbornness that reminded Richard of veteran performers he'd worked with. I just need some warm water with honey first. Lisa immediately went to get it while Richard knelt to look Ben in the eye. You don't have to do this today. We can reschedule. Ben shook his head. The money guy is already here, right? If we make him come back, he'll be even harder to impress. Richard couldn't argue with that logic. At 12 years old, Ben understood the politics of Broadway better than some actors Richard had worked with for decades. Okay, Richard said, but we're going to make some adjustments. You'll only sing 2 songs, not the full rehearsal we planned. And if at any point you feel worse, you tell me immediately. Deal? Ben nodded solemnly. Deal. They walked into the rehearsal room where the rest of the cast was warming up. When they saw Ben, several of the adult performers came over to check on him, genuine concern on their faces. In the few weeks he'd been with the production, Ben had won over everyone with his work ethic and lack of pretension. The kid looks awful. Peter, the composer, whispered to Richard. Can he even sing today? We're about to find out, Richard replied. After Ben had his honey water and spent a few minutes warming up his voice carefully under Diane's supervision, Richard went to get the investors. He found Victor Gray checking his expensive watch, looking thoroughly annoyed. Finally, Victor said, standing up. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about us. Sorry for the delay, Richard said smoothly. We wanted to make sure everything was perfect for your visit. Victor gave him a skeptical look. I hear your young star is under the weather. News traveled fast in theater circles. He's had a slight fever, but he's feeling better now. Victor said, unconvinced. Well, let's see this prodigy of yours. They filed into the rehearsal space where chairs had been set up for them. The full cast was assembled, with Ben standing in the center looking small but composed. If Richard hadn't known the boy was sick, he might not have noticed the slight flush on his cheeks or the careful way he held himself to conserve energy. Richard introduced the investors to the cast and explained they would be showing 2 key scenes from the production. Then he nodded to the piano player, and the rehearsal began. The first scene was a group number with Ben playing a supporting role, singing harmony with the adult leads. He performed adequately, hitting his notes but lacking some of the power Richard had come to expect from him. Victor Gray watched with a neutral expression, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his financial advisor. During the brief pause between scenes, Richard saw Frank giving Ben an encouraging thumbs up from the side of the room. Ben took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. The second scene was Ben's big solo, the emotional heart of the show, where his character discovers the full extent of his own voice and power. As the introduction began, Ben closed his eyes the way he always did before singing. When he opened them again, something had changed. Despite the fever, despite the pressure, despite everything, he was ready. The first notes came out slightly unsteady, and Richard saw Victor lean forward with a frown. But then, as if drawing from some hidden reserve of strength, Ben's voice found its center. Note by note, word by word, he built the song, his voice growing stronger and clearer. By the time he reached the chorus, the sickness seemed to have fallen away. The purity of his tone, the emotional truth behind every word, it filled the room, silencing everyone. Victor Gray sat perfectly still, his previous skepticism replaced by rapt attention. When Ben hit the climactic high note, the one that had made Richard believe in him from the start, he held it with perfect control, letting it soar above them all. In that moment, he wasn't a sick child pushing through a fever. He was an artist at the height of his power. As the final notes faded, the room remained silent for several heartbeats. Then one of the cast members began to applaud, and suddenly everyone was on their feet, even Victor Gray and his advisors. Ben looked surprised by the standing ovation, a genuine smile breaking through his exhaustion. Richard glanced at Frank, who was wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. After the applause died down, Richard thanked the cast and asked them to take 5 while he spoke with the investors. Ben immediately went to his uncle, who wrapped him in a hug and led him to a chair. "Well," Victor said as they walked to the conference room. "He's not what I expected." Richard waited, knowing better than to jump in too quickly. "Is he always that good?" Victor asked. "Actually," Richard said honestly, "today was one of his weaker performances. He's been sick." Victor's eyebrows shot up. "That was him on a bad day?" Richard nodded. "Imagine what he can do when he's healthy." Victor was silent for a moment, considering. "The show's still a risk. Building it around someone so young. Theater is always a risk," Richard pointed out. "But some risks are worth taking." They discussed logistics for another 30 minutes. Understudies, insurance policies, contingency plans for working with a child performer. Victor's questions were tough but fair, and Richard could sense the shift in his attitude from skepticism to cautious interest. Finally, Victor stood up. "I want to speak with the boy." They found Ben still sitting with Frank, looking tired but pleased. The color had drained from his face again now that the adrenaline of performance had faded. "Ben," Richard said, "Mr. Gray would like to talk with you." Ben stood up quickly, wincing slightly as the movement made his head spin. Frank steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. Victor studied the boy carefully. "That was quite a performance, young man." "Thank you, sir," Ben said politely. "How long have you been singing?" Ben thought about it. "As long as I can remember. My mom said I was humming before I could talk." Victor nodded, noting the correction. "And why do you want to be in this show?" It was a simple question, but one that cut to the heart of everything. Richard held his breath, hoping Ben would say something about passion for music or dreams of Broadway. Instead, Ben looked up at Frank, then back at Victor. "My mom loved music more than anything. When she got sick, she couldn't sing anymore, but we'd listen to cast recordings together in the hospital. She told me that songs could tell stories in ways words alone never could." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "After she died, I stopped singing for a while. But then one day I started again, and it felt like she was still with me somehow. So I guess I'm doing this for her, and for Uncle Frank, who worked so hard to take care of me." And he looked at Richard. For people who believed in me when they didn't have to. Victor Gray's expression softened, something Richard had rarely seen in all their years of working together. The hardened Broadway investor looked at this small, sick boy with new eyes. "Well," Victor said after a moment, "that's as good a reason as I've ever heard." He turned to Richard. "You found something special here. Don't waste it." Then to Frank, "Take good care of this boy. He's got a gift." With that, he walked away to rejoin his advisors, but Richard had heard what he needed to hear. The investment was secure. The show would go on. As the investors filed out, Ben swayed slightly on his feet. Frank caught him immediately. "That's it," Frank said firmly. "Back home to bed for you." Ben didn't argue, which told Richard just how exhausted he truly was. As Frank gathered their things, Ben looked up at Richard. "Did I do okay?" he asked, his voice small. Richard felt a lump in his throat. This extraordinary boy who had just saved the entire production while fighting a fever was still looking for reassurance. "Ben," Richard said, crouching down to his level, "you didn't just do okay. You changed minds today. You made people believe in something they didn't think was possible." Ben smiled tiredly. "So I get to keep singing?" "You get to keep singing," Richard confirmed. "Now go get some rest. We have a lot of work ahead of us." As Frank led Ben toward the elevator, Richard watched them go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. Pride, absolutely. But also a growing sense of responsibility that went beyond his role as director. Ben had given everything today. Pushed himself beyond what any child should have to do. And he'd done it not for fame or attention, but for the people he cared about. Richard made a silent promise to himself as the elevator doors closed. Whatever happened with this show, he would make sure that Ben's gift remained a joy, not a burden, because voices like his didn't come along often, and they needed to be protected as fiercely as they were celebrated. Opening night arrived faster than anyone expected. 4 months of intensive rehearsals, costume fittings, technical runs, and preview performances had flown by in a blur of activity. Now, as Richard stood backstage in the crowded wings of the theater, watching the audience file in, he could hardly believe they'd made it. "Nervous?" Lisa asked, appearing beside him with her ever-present clipboard. "Terrified," Richard admitted. "You?" "Same." She glanced toward the dressing rooms. "How's our star doing?" Richard smiled. "See for yourself." They walked to Ben's dressing room, which he shared with Frank. Unlike the adult leads who had demanded private spaces, Ben had insisted on keeping his uncle close by. Richard knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," Frank called. They entered to find Ben sitting in a chair while Frank attempted to fix his bow tie. The boy was dressed in his opening costume, a simple school uniform that would transform throughout the show as his character discovered his voice and power. "Look who's here," Frank said. "The boss," Ben grinned. In the months since they'd begun, he had grown at least an inch taller, and his face had lost some of its childish roundness. But his eyes still held the same mixture of vulnerability and determination that had captivated Richard from the start. "Are people here yet?" Ben asked, trying to peer past them to the hallway. "The theater's filling up," Richard told him. "Going to be a full house." Ben's smile faltered slightly. "That's a lot of people. All here to see you shine," Lisa said encouragingly. Frank finished with the bow tie and stepped back to inspect his work. "There, looking sharp, buddy." Richard noticed the slight tremble in Ben's hands as he touched the tie. "How are you feeling?" "Really?" Ben took a deep breath. "Scared. What if I mess up? What if my voice cracks on the high note? What if I trip on stage?" These were normal fears for any performer, but especially for a 12-year-old making his Broadway debut. Richard sat down in the chair opposite Ben. "Want to know a secret?" he asked. "I directed my first show when I was 25. Opening night, I was so nervous I threw up twice before curtain." Ben's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" And then after all that worry, one of the lead actors forgot his lines in the first scene. "What happened?" "The show went on," Richard said simply. "That's what always happens in theater. Someone covers, the audience rarely notices, and before you know it, you're taking your bow. But what if I forget my lines?" Ben pressed. "Then you'll find your way back," Richard assured him. "You know this show better than anyone. You've worked harder than anyone, and you have something no one else has." "What's that?" Richard smiled. "A voice that made a cranky old director believe in magic again." Ben laughed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. A knock came at the door. "Diane," The vocal coach. 15 minutes to places, everyone. Ben, want to do a quick warm-up? Yes, please, Ben said, standing up. As he followed Diane out, he paused in the doorway, looking back at Richard. Thanks for everything. When they were alone, Frank turned to Richard. He's been like this all day. 1 minute excited, the next terrified. I don't know how to help him. You're already helping just by being here, Richard said. He draws strength from you. Frank looked down at his hands. His mother should be here for this. She'd know exactly what to say to calm his nerves. Maybe she is here in a way, Richard said quietly. Every time he sings? Frank nodded, blinking rapidly. I need to stop or I'll be a mess before the show even starts. Go do your director thing. I'll make sure he gets to his mark on time. Richard headed back to the wings where the organized chaos of final preparations was in full swing. Stagehands adjusted set pieces, actors stretched and whispered lines to themselves, and the stage manager called out time warnings with increasing urgency. Through it all, Richard felt strangely calm. After months of doubts and challenges, Ben's recurring bouts of homesickness, the technical difficulties that had plagued preview week, the critics who'd written skeptical pre-opening articles about building a Broadway show around a child, they had made it to opening night. Whatever happened now was out of his hands. The house lights dimmed and the audience quieted. Richard found himself holding his breath as the orchestra began the overture. The familiar music washed over him, but it felt different tonight, charged with possibility and the weight of all their collective hopes. The curtain rose on the first scene, a classroom full of students, with Ben seated at a desk near the back, deliberately unremarkable. The story would follow his character's journey from invisible outcast to someone who found power and identity through his voice. As the first scene unfolded, Richard watched Ben closely. The boy moved with confidence, hitting his marks perfectly, delivering his lines with natural ease. If he was nervous, it didn't show. And when the moment came for his first small solo, just a few lines in a group number, his voice rose clear and true above the ensemble. The audience responded immediately, a ripple of surprise and appreciation moving through the theater. Richard saw several people lean forward in their seats, attention caught by that distinctive voice. Scene by scene, Ben's character grew bolder, his songs more complex and emotional. Richard knew the most challenging moments were still to come. The confrontation with the music teacher who tried to force his voice into conventional patterns, the heart-wrenching song about his character's late father, and finally, the show-stopping number that had first demonstrated Ben's extraordinary gift back in that fateful audition. When intermission arrived, Richard barely had time to check on Ben before the second act began. The boy was flushed with the exhilaration of performance, eyes bright. They like it, he whispered excitedly to Richard. I can feel them listening. They love it, Richard corrected. And they haven't even heard the best part yet. The second act opened with gathering momentum, building toward the climactic sequence where Ben's character would finally embrace the full power of his voice. As the scene approached, Richard felt his own heart racing. This was the moment everything had been leading, toward the emotional core of the show and the ultimate test of Ben's ability to carry a Broadway production on his young shoulders. The stage darkened to a single spotlight. Ben stood alone at center stage, his character having reached the breaking point after a series of rejections and disappointments. The orchestra began the delicate introduction to Finding My Way Home, the song that had started it all, the one Ben had sung in his very first audition. As Ben began to sing, Richard was transported back to that afternoon in the empty theater, when a small boy in worn sneakers had opened his mouth and changed everything. But this wasn't the same boy. This Ben had grown, not just in height but in skill and understanding. His voice had the technical polish of months of professional training now, but it hadn't lost that raw emotional quality that had made it special from the beginning. The theater fell completely silent except for that voice, soaring, diving, weaving through the complex melody with seemingly effortless control. Richard watched the audience instead of the stage, seeing the same wonder on their faces that he had felt the first time. Several people were crying openly by the final chorus. When the song ended, there was a moment of absolute stillness, that magical pause between the end of something extraordinary and the world's response to it. Then the audience erupted, applause thundering through the theater in a standing ovation that came in the middle of the show rather than at the end. Ben stood frozen in the spotlight, clearly overwhelmed by the response. It wasn't in the stage directions, wasn't something they'd rehearsed. This moment of a child confronting the power of his gift and its effect on others. Richard saw him swallow hard, tears glistening in his eyes before he gave a small, humble bow and continued with the scene as the applause gradually subsided. The rest of the show built on that emotional peak, carrying the audience through to a triumphant finale. When the final curtain fell and rose again for bows, the standing ovation was immediate and unanimous. As Ben took his solo bow, the cheers reached a deafening level and flowers began to appear at the edge of the stage. Richard watched from the wings, his own vision blurring with tears. Frank stood beside him, openly crying as his nephew basked in the well-deserved recognition. "He did it," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "My sister would be so proud." "We all are," Richard replied. Later, after the opening night party had wound down and most of the cast had gone home, Richard found Ben and Frank sitting quietly on the edge of the empty stage. "Looking out at the rows of vacant seats, not ready to leave?" Richard asked, joining them. Ben shook his head. "I just want to remember how it felt." In case what?" Richard prompted. The boy shrugged. "In case it never happens again." Richard understood. Success in theater was fleeting, unpredictable. Even with the night's triumph, there were no guarantees for tomorrow. "Whether it happens again or not," Richard said, "no one can take tonight away from you. You earned every second of that applause." Ben smiled tiredly. "It didn't feel like just me up there. It felt like all of us together, you and Uncle Frank and Diane and the whole cast. Like we all made something bigger than any of us could make alone." Richard was struck by the wisdom in those words. That's exactly what theater is supposed to be. Frank put an arm around Ben's shoulders. "Come on, superstar. Time to get some rest. You've got another show tomorrow." As they stood to leave, Ben turned to Richard. "Remember when you made me sing that really hard song as a test? Back when we first met?" Richard nodded, remembering his skepticism, his challenge designed to reveal the limits of this child's ability. "I was so scared," Ben admitted, "but then I just closed my eyes and sang, and I could feel something change in the room. I could feel you believing in me." He looked up at Richard with clear, earnest eyes. "Thank you for believing first, before anyone else did." Richard felt something shift in his chest, that final piece of his cynical heart that had been holding out against complete transformation. This journey had begun with him testing a boy's voice, but somewhere along the way, that voice had tested him instead, challenged him to remember why he'd fallen in love with theater, why art mattered, why taking chances on unlikely miracles was always worth the risk. "Thank you," Richard said simply, "for reminding me how to listen." As they walked together toward the stage door, the theater quiet around them, Richard thought about the uncertain director he'd been all those months ago, burned out, jaded, going through the motions. And he thought about the director he was now, renewed, inspired, changed by a voice he'd almost sent away without a proper hearing. Sometimes the most extraordinary talents came in the most ordinary packages, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, you remembered to listen closely enough to hear them.